Confessions of a Killer. Samuel Little, the man who confessed to an utterly shocking 93 murders between 1970 and 2005. With such a staggering body count, Little may be the most prolific serial killer in American history. His horrific crimes spread fear and grief across the nation during a 35-year reign of violence that law enforcement seemed unable to stop. On the surface, Little seemed like an average transient drifting across the country. But beneath this facade lurked a stone-cold predator who spent decades hunting vulnerable women to satisfy his twisted desires.
I had this black chick up in the car, and just got through killing her. That's mother pulled up with the sheriff pulled up.
Now, through exhaustive investigations and Little's own chilling confessions, the sheer scale of his sadistic, 35-year killing spree is finally coming to light. How was Little able to carry out so many brutal murders in so many places without ever getting caught? We'll look at his transient lifestyle and how he targeted victims living on the margins of society. And we'll examine the horrific confessions that ultimately exposed just how much blood was on his hands. Let's start at the beginning. Samuel Little was born in 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, though he was raised primarily by his grandmother in Ohio. Little claims he suffered abuse as a child that warped his psyche. As a teenager, he began having violent sexual fantasies about strangling women, disturbing urges he acted out on animals. These early warning signs pointed to the sinister path ahead. In his 20s, Little began drifting around the United States, racking up arrests for crimes like theft, fraud, armed robbery, and rape across multiple states. But then in the early 1970s, his inner demons fully emerged, and his offenses took a deadly turn. Little started crisscrossing the country, unleashing his sick desires upon vulnerable women in a sprawling, decades-long murder spree that evaded justice at every turn. Little's first known victim was Mary Brosley, found strangled in Miami, Florida in 1971. But the transient killer quickly disappeared. Over the next 35 years, nude and battered female bodies started turning up in alleyways and canals across at least 19 states. But with no clear connections between cases, the murders went unsolved, allowing the elusive Little to keep killing again and again while communities lived in fear. Part of what allowed Little to evade justice for so long was his lifestyle. He was constantly on the move, a drifter hunting the most marginalized victims, like prostitutes, addicts, and homeless women who often went unnoticed in life and unmourned in death. Places like Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, Ohio, California, and more became Little's sinister hunting grounds. By his own twisted account, he claimed many lives during his coast-to-coast murder spree. Let's examine some of his most chilling confessions.
Now, when you're driving around with Patricia Mount in the front passenger seat, did you have any conversation with her?
My mind was on killing her. She let me feel her throat, I was caressing it. And before I knew it, I tied my hands around it and strangled her to death.
In 1982, Little admitted to meeting an attractive 30-something black woman at a nightclub in New Orleans, Louisiana. He lured her into his vehicle and drove her out to a canal off Interstate 10. There, he strangled the life out of her before dumping her body, which was never found. The city was just one of many stops on his murder tour that left grieving families without closure.
Hey, tell me about Northern Kentucky, the girl that you met in Columbus.
A few years later in 1984, Little picked up a 25-year-old white female hitchhiker outside a strip club in Covington, Kentucky.
She walked over to me, said, come on, y'all, can you take me to Miami?
How tall do you think she was?
She
Little remembers the woman was 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed between 130 to 170 pounds. She had short blonde hair, blue eyes, and a hippie style. She asked Little for a ride to Miami to see her mom. Little agreed. They drove south together on the I-75 freeway. They stopped in Cincinnati and spent time downtown on Vine Street. Then they kept driving over the river into northern Kentucky. Little drove to some hills not far from the freeway. He went up a small dirt road to the top of a round hill. There, he strangled her inside his car before leaving her nude body atop a rural hillside, where she again disappeared without a trace. More lives vanished while Little roamed free. But Little's deadly spree started even earlier.
Tell me about Mary Ann.
She's what you nowadays they call a transient.
Around 1971 or 1972 in Miami, Florida, he crossed paths with an 18-year-old transgender black woman named Mary Ann at a local bar. He drove her out to the Everglades under the pretense of taking her home. There, along an isolated dirt road, he murdered her and dragged her into the swamp, once more leaving no evidence behind while her loved ones were left with only questions. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Little simply continued his sadistic pattern coast to coast virtually unimpeded while communities tried desperately to protect their most vulnerable members. He would blow into a new town, settle into the local transient community, scout a vulnerable new victim, satisfy his twisted desires, and move on before anyone suspected a thing.
Las Vegas. Describe the Las Vegas victim.
That was in '93.
For instance, in 1993, Little met a 40-year-old black female on a Las Vegas, Nevada street and took her back to his motel. There he strangled her to death before stuffing her body into his car trunk and dumping her down a remote embankment, likely never to be found. By this point, Little harbored no fear of the consequences, so depraved was his meticulous and brutal process. And from 1992 to 1994, Little killed a 24-year-old black woman in Little Rock, Arkansas, discarding her naked body in a rural cornfield, just one of many lives he took before slipping away again. Little lurked on the fringes carrying out his evil rituals, believing he could operate with impunity as communities struggled to protect their most vulnerable members. But in 2012, his luck finally ran out. Little was arrested in Kentucky and extradited to California to face drug charges. And there, advanced forensics would finally tie him to unsolved murders across the country. DNA evidence definitively linked Little to 3 brutally beaten and strangled women found naked in Los Angeles alleyways in the late 1980s. Their bodies showed they endured unspeakable suffering, the work of a violently sadistic killer who had honed his skills on victims nationwide. In 2014, Little went on trial for these killings. Prosecutors effectively painted him as a calculating predator of vulnerable women who left a trail of devastation coast to coast. Convicted on all 3 murder counts, it seemed Little would die in jail, case closed. But the nightmare was far from over. In 2019, Little stunned the nation when he casually confessed to dozens more murders in exchange for a prison transfer. Investigators quickly realized this was no ruse, it was a shockingly depraved killer openly confronting his gruesome legacy. A dedicated FBI task force began working urgently to verify Little's accounts of slaying marginalized women across 19 states over 35 horrific years. The horrific details soon emerged. Little admitted to specifically hunting and strangling vulnerable targets like addicts and prostitutes, often just using his bare hands to satisfy his twisted desires. He could describe victims' appearances and murder locations in chilling detail. By late 2018, the feds had definitively tied Little to 34 cold case slayings through DNA evidence and his twisted confessions. Among his many victims were mothers, daughters, sisters, cases that had gone unsolved for decades, leaving families without answers. For still grieving families, Little's confessions finally provided answers but reopened wounds long thought scarred over. Investigators continue working to confirm over 50 more cold cases based on his statements. Given the number of slain marginalized women across the time frame of his offending, experts believe Little's victim count likely exceeds 100, a staggering toll that may make him the worst serial murderer in U.S. history. So how did this seemingly unremarkable drifter get away with so much murder? By living completely off the grid and targeting victims on the fringes who often went unnoticed, Little was able to hide in plain sight for over 35 nightmarish years. For communities shattered by his violence, Little's confessions have brought some closure along with renewed grief and shock at the scale of one man's inhumanity. While the full extent of his evil may never be quantified, families can take comfort knowing the truth has finally emerged from the darkness that long shrouded his crimes. However painful, names and voices have been restored to Little's forgotten victims. Survivors have been given some semblance of peace. In the end, Little thought nobody could ever trace the sprawling trail of horror he left across nearly 2 decades in 20 states. But he was wrong. Through advancements in forensics and revelations from his own twisted mind, justice has finally prevailed over the secrets this monster kept for so long. So what do you all make of Little's bone-chilling confessions and his staggering body count? How did one seemingly ordinary man perpetrate such open brutality for so long while evading justice? Share your insights below.